Hope everyone had a restful 45-second break. Sorry about that. So the House has passed a repeal in the exemption to the cloud tax a few times, sent it over to the Senate. We were talking about, in the last 2 weeks, we've talked about both tax expenditures, which any tax exemption is, as well as gone deep into the sales tax. And then we've also been talking about the Ed Fund, and we're going to continue talking about the Ed Fund more regularly going forward so that we can set the yield for the year. So starting in the next few weeks, we'll just be sort of looking at Ed Fund updates regularly in order to figure that out. So in the context of all of those things, we're going to dive a little deeper into the exemption to the sales tax for cloud. And Abby is going to start us off on that. And then Patrick Titterton's going to join us. Great.
Okay. I can make this as long or as short as you would like. Great. So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. This is on the committee's webpage under today's date under my name. And it's a slightly lengthy title. It's sort of colloquially referred to as the cloud tax, which makes me cringe a tiny bit every time I hear that because it's actually sales tax. And the cloud more generally in sales tax terminology is considered pre-written computer software. There are legal definitions for that. And the exemption we'll be talking about is when that type of software is accessed remotely. So jumping into the second slide, laying out the general framework, we're talking about sales tax, how sales tax generally applies. The most common application of sales tax that we usually talk about and think about when we're talking about sales tax is to goods. And that is defined as tangible personal property. The sales tax applies to retail sales of tangible personal property unless there's an exemption. Tangible personal property, or TPP, is defined in statute as personal property which may be seen, weighed, measured, felt, touched, or in any other manner perceived by the senses. And there's a second sentence within that definition that lays out to clarify other types of goods that are considered TPP for purposes of sales tax. So that includes electricity, water, gas, steam, and pre-written computer software. And this definition is taken from the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement, which we've talked about, which is the multi-state agreement that Vermont is a member state of and has been since 2007, which provides these model definitions, and member states incorporate them into their laws and are not given a lot of leeway into how these are drafted or how they're interpreted. So there is that important clarification there. So unlike TPP, I've noted there is another category that sales tax applies to. There are several other categories, including services. Very few services are taxed in Vermont, but there are some, such as charges for entrance to entertainment, places of entertainment, used to be called amusement charges. So TPP, TPP explicitly includes pre-written computer software. And there was a question, part of sort of the genesis of this discussion was whether when you're accessing pre-written computer software, so it's like canned software, when you're accessing that through the cloud, whether that's a service or a TPP. So moving on to slide 3, there is also a definition for pre-written computer software. It is actually in regulation. It is not in statute. And this definition, again, is taken from the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement. So pre-written computer software means computer software, including pre-written upgrades. So again, that pre-written part is important, which is not designed and developed by the author or other creator to the specifications of a specific purchaser. So it's what's also called commercial off-the-shelf software, COTS. It is not customized to an individual user. Looking at statute and regulation, and then we look to session law. This is slide 4. When we're talking about pre-written computer software that is accessed through the internet, accessed remotely, there is an existing exemption. It is not codified in statute. It is in session law. It was enacted in 2015, And it states that charges for the right to access remotely pre-written software shall not be considered charges for tangible personal property. Because tangible personal property has explicitly states pre-written computer software is taxable as DPP, this exemption says it's not taxable as DPP when it's accessed remotely. Stop there and see if there are questions about the state of the law, and then I'll explain how the legislature and its interaction with industry and the Department of Tax's interpretations of the law, how it led to this state of the law. Hopefully that background is clear.
Seems that way.
Okay, excellent. A summary of current law is provided on slide 5 to try and clarify what is taxable, what is not. And I'm not sure that I have not seen this in the last few years, but if you were to purchase an actual box of software, I'd say Staples, that you're going to put onto your computer, I guess not many computers have even CD readers or DVD readers anymore. If you were to purchase physical storage media in Vermont, that's taxable. If you were to download it onto your computer in Vermont, that would be taxable. However, if you are purely accessing it through the cloud online, that is not taxable.
Oops, can you say that again?
Absolutely.
You download it, it's taxable, but then when is it not taxable?
If you're accessing it through online, so through a server or through providers.
Not accessing the download, accessing the software.
Yes, so
Okay.
you're running it through the cloud.
I see.
And I am not the best person to explain the technology of that.
I get it, it's okay.
What about in the case of, and this maybe this is off topic, but like my 99-cent charge per month for cloud services on like my photos and whatnot from Apple. Is that already taxable, or would that be taxable?
So charges for subscriptions are typically taxable, and for most of the streaming services that we're all familiar with, like for television and movies, those are taxable and
Okay.
as well.
But this is like a cloud backup. It's sort of like for a backup to some server
Right.
somewhere.
It would depend on whether you're using the software. That's a great example of why this gets so confusing and
Yeah.
what is what's in the taxable and not in the taxable bucket, because of the different ways of structuring both transactions. In that case, that seems to fall more in a subscription style. But in that case, it might also be considered a service. That's where it gets a little more confusing.
Yeah, it's very different from getting a Netflix or a Hulu subscription. It's more of a, backup to a remote site.
The pre-written computer software that's accessed remotely is more where you're getting onto a server or a platform or using software to in some way do some sort of process online. My sort of off the cuff interpretation would be that doesn't fall into that
Okay.
taxable
Right.
area.
Thank you. Sorry to go down a.
No, that's always the discussion is this in, is this out? And it's hard to say without having, because it hasn't been taxable, all of this has been exempt. All of these different types of software that are accessed online have been exempt. And part of the policy reason behind that was because of the confusion. And on slide 6, show back to 2010, this is when the Department of Taxes first issued a technical bulletin saying, we interpret the law as imposing sales tax on pre-written software, regardless of whether it's accessed physically, downloaded, or through the cloud online. The legislature responded to that, saying 2 years later, saying, no, stop imposing sales tax, and we will refund any tax paid from, sort of retroactively refund any tax paid from January 1st, 2007 through January 1st, 2013. And during that time, the department issued further guidance that did not become regulation or rule, trying to outline when pre-written software is exempt or taxed. And then following that guidance, the legislature again acted in 2015 to create a full exemption saying none of this is taxable. Again, because the House has considered this proposal and has passed several proposals to tax the cloud, so to tax sales of pre-written computer software accessed remotely. In 2019, the legislature required the department to work with the industry, the tech sector, on how current law functions, and if it were to be repealed, how different types of software accessed remotely would be treated. And they did come in and provide testimony in 2020. So following that education effort. I did provide the most recent legislative proposal, but which was from 2021, but I might skip over that and continue to talk about some of the different terms and then go back to that proposal. I'm realizing I probably should have organized my slides a little differently. So jumping over slide 8, moving on to slide 9. And then I have a little bit of information about other states and how they have treated pre-written computer software accessed remotely. So there are 3 general terms that are used not uniformly, either in law or in the industry. But what is generally discussed when talking about the cloud is software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. Software as a service is when a service provider is hosting software over the internet for a customer, called often cloud application services. That's often what people are referring to, but that's not the only type of cloud. There's also infrastructure as a service where the service provider owns, maintains, operates, houses equipment. So you have the infrastructure more like the hardware, and that's used to support a customer's operations. And then that customer accesses that hardware over the internet. And platform as a service is a mixture of the two. And it's a framework where developers build on and use that platform to create customized applications for customers. But again, the part that is being discussed here is only what's canned. So it's not customized to an individual user. And I am glad that JFO is in the room because Pat will provide some examples. But again, I always want to sort of forewarn that this, because it is a changing area, changing industry, saying one type is taxable or not, it's hard, those are sort of theoretical. And I wouldn't want to say, this particular taxpayer would be subject to this and another wouldn't.
And my memory of the conversation last year in committee was that given that it was very hard to clearly delineate between those 3 sort of theoretical categories, it seemed easiest to make them all taxable.
That is exactly the policy discussion that has happened, both around the exempting everything, and then this committee in particular will propose to tax everything so that you don't get into what's platform, what's software as a service, what's infrastructure, because it is complex.
Yeah.
And just thinking about our conversation yesterday around USF and voice lines, like technology is moving so fast, it's hard for us to be responsive and adapt. And you almost could see that people might start describing their product differently if one was taxable and one wasn't.
That's a good point. That is sort of always the tension of codifying and legislating, is that technology changes so quickly. So I do have you have a longer process for many good reasons. So on slide 10, this is not my map, but there is on this TaxJar website, which provides general information about state tax requirements. This gives you a general view of where software as a service is taxed or is not taxed, or is taxed but with conditions such as the use of the software. So some states have a business exemption, commercial exemption, and that has its limits. Some are for smaller businesses. And then there in the gray are the states with no sales tax. I do just want to point out that, and I did think to put a note in here, Alaska doesn't have a state sales tax. It has local sales taxes, which was not super clear in this map. So Vermont is shown in blue. Blue is the exempt. exempt states. And then I have a chart of my own research last year on states where software as a service is taxed or not taxed, or where there is no sales tax. Each of these, I'm sorry.
You said you have a map of what?
The map is on slide 10 of state by state, and then I have a chart in a chart form.
Sorry.
And part of the challenge of looking at, especially the three different types and how states treat them, is that each state is doing this in a different way legally. So some states are doing it in statute, others are doing it through regulation, others through court decisions and administrative guidance, and many, again, because the SAS, PASS, and IAC are not explicitly defined, it's hard to determine. So in some of these cases, I was sort of trying to interpret either guidance or statute in other states, which is always a little precarious. So I've also bolded in this chart the states that are streamlined members, because they will have the same definitions that Vermont either has or would be required to use to be in compliance with the agreement. On slide 12, I have a few recent changes showing that this is going in both directions, where states are taxing or exempting software as a service in particular. Indiana, for example, recently in 2018 exempted software as a service, whereas Rhode Island moved towards taxing vendor-hosted pre-written computer software. Rhode Island is a streamlined state. And Massachusetts also in 2020 had Citrix, so the online remote access software. There was a court case there laying out taxability of software as a service. So moving back up, unless there are any questions on other states, and I'd be happy to look into that in more detail. I do, again, have to say that a lot of these states don't have explicit guidance on how they treat this type of software, especially when they're not a streamlined state.
Thank you.
Great. Moving back up to slide 8, sorry to jump around. This is I provided an example just for discussion purposes, and I do not have the actual language here, but I have the summary of it. And the multiple different parts that would need to be enacted in order to have a repeal of the exemption and then to apply sales and use tax to all of those forms of pre-written computer software accessed remotely. And again, this is just an example. You're not bound by this in any way, but this is what was passed out of the House last in 2021 as an amendment to another bill. So it would have repealed the session law exemption. It would apply both the sales and the use tax to all forms of software. And then it creates a new definition following both Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Washington state's laws on pre-written computer software. Using the terminology from Rhode Island is vendor-hosted pre-written computer software, which is canned software accessed through the internet or a vendor-hosted server or platform. And that includes where possession of the software is maintained remotely by a vendor or a third party.
And the word canned automatically gets around the difference between one size fits all and customized. So canned means it's not customized.
Correct.
So if you've hired an architect for customized, it wouldn't be even under the
It
stream.
wouldn't be taxable, exactly, because that's not part of
Yeah,
the.
it's not part of the
pre-written
canned.
computer.
Okay,
Exactly.
got it. Under streamline.
Under streamline and what Vermont has enacted into its own statute and
Yeah, yeah.
regulations. So canned is that's not in the language.
That's your
That's my
way of
summary of it.
phraseology.
Yes, pre-written computer software is canned software. I think the streamlined agreement actually has that explicitly in it, not as the definition, but to explain it as well. Sort of an industry understanding of what sort of software it is. And then it lays out in this definition of vendor-hosted pre-written computer software, it lays out that it doesn't matter what the method of delivery or transfer is, so that gets at the cloud, it being online, whether the access is permanent or temporary, and it doesn't matter how the charge is being collected. So it could be the subscription example, per use, per license. Any of those types of charges are considered taxable. So it's broad, which then leaves many of those questions as to what's in and what's out up to the Department of Tax's administrative authority. So this would likely require further regulations and certainly more guidance for taxpayers that would come from the department. So in terms of statutory language, it's fairly explicit, but it is still broad. And then under that proposal, just pulling up the effective dates, that was one interesting discussion that the committee had. It would have taken effect a year later. And it was also June 1st to allow for a full fiscal year of collections. So that was just one policy decision that was made. That concludes my portion of the legal background. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thanks.
What do you know, here we are today. Abby just finished drafting up a bill which taxes software in all three forms.
How fun.
And I asked for just a simple version of what we did last year, knowing that this committee would do whatever it wanted. But if anybody wants to sign on to something, I have a draft here.
Thank you. And
Having done the work, I might as well put it in and we'll have it, and we can blame me for people who don't like it. Which,
thank you.
context, as Emily said, we did attempt to do this once, actually passed it, and it was the Shumlin administration with the help of software developers in Chittenden County, I think principally,
Yes.
who succeeded in just scuttling the thing. It wasn't implemented, it was just kind of, anyway, shoved under the bus, I guess. But anyway, so software development has come a very long time since then. It's not a fledgling industry that we're trying to do some harm to. It's more and more the way things are done. And so my belief anyway is, come on, let's get back on the bus here and do it correctly. So,
Well, I'm curious how much money we're talking about. So I think we can find that out.
well, I'll get it downstairs
Yeah.
as soon as I can. Peter said he wants to sign on, and anybody else is welcome.
Thanks.
But as we understand, this is where the industry is moving. This is a growing source of potential income. It's a growing industry regardless. And we won't be doing software developers any harm at all.
Thanks.
My 10 cents. Thank you. Hearing about that.
So Patrick, Jim's 10 cents would turn into how many dollars?
So Pat Titterton, Joint Fiscal Office. My answer is that depends on if you want to start with a little context or if you want to go straight to the numbers.
You can provide some context.
All right. So I have a few slides that Sorsha has posted on the webpage. I can give everyone a second to pull that up if you want. But I guess I can start with the first slide because I don't know who ripped off who, but Abby and I have the same slide in both of our presentations. So the first is just, sort of starting with definitions of, what SaaS, platform as a service and infrastructure as a service are. What Abby referenced is that if you just, I'm assuming you all just digested when Abby presented this slide. So if we just move on to slide 3, I actually have some examples of what some of these different programs are. So for me, when I file my taxes, I use TurboTax. You go onto the TurboTax website, you input all of your information, it gets sent out to their hosted
Do
server.
it by hand? I'm sorry, keep on going. I don't mean to distract.
But so when I do that, I pay my taxes through them. That's a software as a service. As it currently stands, I'm not taxed on that. So, I get my full refund amount. And that's one way that's one example of a software as a service. For platforms as a service, one good example is Squarespace. So if you're a small business, you're setting up your website for your business, you might opt to use Squarespace to, sort of be the platform that hosts your website. And then I don't know as much about this last section because it is a little confusing. But, some examples of the infrastructure would be those like Amazon Web Services. A lot of businesses use those for hosting their data and stuff like that.
My understanding from last time we had this conversation is that about like 98% of infrastructure as a service is owned by two corporations, and those are the two corporations that own it. And then sort of all of these other companies then buy from infrastructure as a service providers.
Yes. So if we're good on some of these examples, if we move to slide 4, I just wanted to illustrate quickly how quickly this industry has been growing. So the chart you see there is for all prepackaged software, but you can see even just in that it's been growing, almost with a parabolic shape to it. We found that, some articles have suggested that, 67% of enterprise software is estimated to be cloud-based. So, there's a subsection of this prepackaged software that is cloud software, which is included in this chart. And, from just looking at these cloud services, I would feel comfortable in saying that a large majority of the growth has been specifically in those services. So it's a rapidly growing market. And then I don't know if this next slide on slide 5 is a little out of place, but I guess if we go back, and I think this is based on the sort of example legislation that Abby was just talking about. But it's just a few examples of what happens when certain types of software are purchased or services. So you had just used the example of customized software. That was, if it's fully customized, specifically for a company's purpose, that's still not taxable even under that example legislation. Maintenance services are considered a service, so that's also not taxable. But there is a little bit of squishiness when you get into bundled transactions. So like if you buy some kind of pre-written software and there's a maintenance contract for that software included in the price, if the seller does not itemize those two items in the sale, the whole value is taxable. But if they do itemize the receipt, then you would only have to apply the tax to the software that was purchased. Business to business sales in that example would be taxable. And then for other states, if a Vermont company makes a pre-written software and sells it to a customer in that state where that software is taxable, that Vermont company should be collecting and remitting that sales tax to that state.
Bless you.
Bless you.
When you were doing research for slide 4, I'm curious if you saw perhaps any difference in sales trends in states that are already taxing this software.
I did not, but that would be an interesting thing to look at.
I know, I mean, the comparison would be really hard given like all the
Yeah.
theories of this industry and how I wouldn't want to mix up our correlation and causation there. But
Yeah, so one thing that does make that a little difficult is that there's not a whole lot of state level data on this. I can find US national sales or global sales on this, which are easier to track down, but I do have the intention of giving it one last try to see if I can find some better state specific data on this. But yeah, right now I'm kind of operating with national level data that's available. So if we're all ready for the reveal, we can move to slide 6. And so we're estimating for, we would estimate $18.4 million in revenue from this. Just to provide a little context, last year around the same time, we were estimating 16.8. Year prior, I think it was around 11 million. So it's a rapidly growing market, which, is pushing, continuously pushing up our estimates every time we do them.
Can you remind us where sales tax revenue goes?
Education fund.
Thanks.
Good talk.
And I guess one thing that I did find interesting about, when I was going through updating this, so I was actually this summer at a conference in DC where a gentleman from the state of Colorado presented on this very topic. And what they did was actually very interesting. So they recently implemented a cloud tax. They had estimated that they were going to get about $85 million in revenue from it, I think was the figure. What they even also did was add a line item on sales tax, like on your receipts. So you had a sales tax line and you had a sales tax applied to cloud services software, which is really unique. The unfortunate thing is when they got the actual revenue, reported on that particular line item, they were getting something like $8 million. So while it's a really interesting tool, the general thought is that it created confusion amongst vendors and they're just not filling out the form correctly, which is unfortunate because that would be a really unique and great way to get data on almost any product. But it does obviously create some confusion for actual people in the market.
Yeah.
Couldn't you do that with SKUs?
Well, so I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Well, you were asking people to put this on your line, but I think I remember learning that every product has a SKU. So could you just not sort for a particular SKU?
So I think I might be answering your question, but let me know if I'm not. So when you, as the customer, went onto Amazon and you purchased some software as a service, they would give you your receipt, just outlining the value of your sale. And when they reported or when they remitted those taxes back to the state of Colorado, what they were supposed to be doing is telling the value of the sales tax collected on the software as a service, for example, which was, even though it's the same tax rate and going to the same place, different than the general sales tax line.
Yeah, I just generally, if we wanted to know how much a taxable item was break generating, I would think you could somehow, I don't know, but in cash registers, they have to do the SKUs, sort it by SKU.
I don't have access to that data.
I don't think the tax department does either.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
believe Representative Beck has a cash register.
when businesses submit their sales tax report at the end of every month, they don't provide that amount of detail. It's just gross sales that are tax exempt, and then that's it.
But in a world where anything could be possible, could that be possible to track? I mean, if you sent all that stuff from your cash register?
I don't know if it would even be helpful because a SKU doesn't, I don't think a SKU means anything to somebody unless they say what it is. So a business would say this SKU is a backpack,
Yeah,
but that SKU doesn't mean anything until the business assigns a backpack. So they could send a SKU to tax and tax would just be like, it's a number, that's all it is. They wouldn't know.
Like there's no standard.
so.
Yeah, there's no standard. It's not like an ISBN.
That, I did not know.
Like an ISBN barcode, there's a standard there. That number means a title, but most merchandise isn't like that.
One last question, so if I buy something in one store, but that store has one SKU on it and another store could have a totally different SKU?
The SKU can mean something different in a different start.
I would offer this might be an interesting conversation for someone who's interested in joining the Streamline sales tax. Just gonna keep on shopping once a week amongst it all.
So that's what I have for now.
Thank you.
Like I said, seems like every time I go to update this estimate, it goes up. So in a few months' time, maybe we'll see where we're at again. Yeah.
Just the history of that experience, as Representative Maslin said, had its origins in the argument often referred to as the infant industry argument, which has a long, centuries-long history in international trade. And the argument people say, well, if we want our steel industry to grow, we ought to protect steel from the more advanced people who can sell it cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. My willingness to sign on is a statement of this is long since past the infant stage. And so I don't know why we would use that as an excuse for exempting it. We don't do that for any other mature industry.
And we don't have a bill in front of us yet, team. Representative Odie.
Tim's working.
Completely different from the SKU question that I had. Are there other things that people are accessing from the internet that are form? Like I'm thinking of, I've never looked, so I'm just gonna see what you say. If you decided you didn't want to go to a lawyer for the lawyer to write a will for you, and so you went online, we offer wills packaged, and would that, are we treating like to like? I mean, if you buy it and it's not, and you don't, it's just exactly the way it is, just like some of the cloud services are, like a box of it, then there, in the case of a will, is that taxed? And then the second question would be, if you have a lawyer make changes to it, let's say you go to the lawyer and say, well, this is where I started, and then after this, help me make changes. Is there an analogy there with how the sales tax does or doesn't apply in either instance?
So just to make sure I understand the question, you're asking if you went online and essentially access legal services online?
Well, I'm not sure that maybe it's legal services that you're accessing, or maybe it's, because I haven't tried it, just came to us thinking about this, but maybe it's just like a boxed product.
Do you have an example in mind? I'd be happy to sort of look into it.
Maybe I can ask you afterwards.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that kind of program. I don't have a will, I guess. I should have a will.
Oh, well.
Other than the legal services we're offering you right now, does anyone have anything else as we close up this conversation? And then maybe once we have a bill, we can dive back in. Thank you. And next up, Becky is joining us to talk about the fee report and some of the history of that conversation. And then we'll hear from Ted on some of the analysis that JFO has done.
Becky Wasserman, Legislative Counsel. There should be a slide presentation available, an overview of the fee report and request. So I'm just gonna go over, as you all know, we haven't had a fee bill in a number of years, but I'm gonna go over what the process says it should be in statute for having a fee bill. So first on the first slide, I just wanted to note what the definition of a fee is in statute. So in Title 32, it's defined as a monetary charge by an agency or the judiciary for a service or product provided to or the regulation of specified classes of individuals or entities. Confusingly, the definition of fee in statute also says that certain charges are exempt from being considered a fee under statute. And there's a whole list of them. I gave some examples. There's charges established by certain commissions, boards, and departments. For example, a charge established under the jurisdiction of the Public Utility Commission, the Board of Liquor and Lottery. There's, I believe, a charge established by the Department of Financial Regulation as authorized by law. So all of those are not technically fees as defined under statute for the purposes of a fee bill. There's other references to certain money that's put into an enterprise or internal service fund, money from interest and premium payments. So there's a whole list. And then at the end, helpfully, it says, and any other charge exempt by law. So there are a number of places in statute where it specifies that that charge is not considered a fee. So that's very clear.
Not a fee, what is it?
So a charge, or it could be a tax. I don't know if, I think Abby came in maybe to talk about the distinction between fees and taxes. If not, we can.
I don't know if she did. I don't think she did.
Okay.
But we can have her in to do that if you don't want to speak to that right now.
I mean, I can, so generally speaking, a fee should be tied to like the service or product that, the cost should be tied to the service or product being offered, where a tax is more sort of generally applicable for a governmental purpose. So even if you call something a charge or an assessment, you can sort of analyze that it's actually a tax.
Yeah, Carolyn.
And the big thing about fee and versus a tax is that the money we collect from a fee goes to maintain the production of that good or service. And the money we collect from a tax goes to general government.
That's
all of government.
That's one of the sort of main distinctions. And the fee,
Easiest way.
yeah, and the fee should be going into like a special fund for that specific.
That's why we have so many funds in Vermont. There's like 400 funds.
Yeah, we love special funds here.
You know, great milking machines and one, you know, there's all these different kinds of funds that fees generate.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
And the next.
You're in the right place.
Read the CAFR, the end of year, it has all the special funds listed, so you can.
If you read the what?
The CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, I think. At the end of the year, you can learn all about the hundreds of special funds we have. On the second page of the slide is the definition of fee for the purposes of the executive branch fee report. So this is a definition that I think is slightly broader in terms of what has to be reported. So it says that any source of state revenue classified by the Department of Finance and Management accounting systems as fees, business licenses, non-business licenses, and fines and penalties. And in addition, Finance and Management shall identify any of the other state revenue sources that function in fact as a fee and reclassify them as fees. Okay. So the fee chapter in Title 32 has a statement of purpose, and that purpose makes it very clear that there should be a uniform policy on the creation and review of executive and judicial branch fees. And it also gives the General Assembly the sole authority to create, review, and adjust fees. And then, of course, there are certain exceptions. But I think it was sort of the intent, if you look at the statement of the purpose of that chapter, that fees should be created by the General Assembly. And then in 32 VSA 603, it explicitly says that fees can only be established by an act of the General Assembly. So next slide. So in general, the rate or amount of or any adjustments to a fee are set by the act of the General Assembly. The exceptions that are in statute are that in certain situations, a rate may be adjusted by the Joint Fiscal Committee. And then certain fees, there's a list of them in statutes, may be set by the department that provide the service or product. But it says that those fees must be reasonably and directly related to their costs and must be credited to special funds.
I've been sort of finding those randomly the last few years, and I'm curious if you know if there's any sort of rhyme or reason to how a couple departments wound up with sort of that authority and other departments didn't.
So this list of the authority of what they can set are things like not specific to certain departments, but just things like transcripts, printing, conferences, publications of the department, the sort of exemption from what is considered a fee, like that certain departments have. I don't know the history of how those, like, for example, anything set by the Department of Financial Regulation, it says is a charge and not a fee. And I'm not sure how that, for example, was allowed. And I think that there are sort of limited situations in which fees can be set by rule. And again, those are exceptions that I'm not sure how that came about.
And you've never seen a rhyme or reason to where those exceptions are or aren't?
No.
Okay.
I wonder, the rates that may be adjusted by the Joint Fiscal Committee, you said in some circumstances.
If a fee is set by an act of the General Assembly, that rate can be adjusted by an action of the Joint Fiscal Committee if projected revenues as demonstrated by the agency that's proposing the adjustment are reasonably related to the cost of providing the associated service or product or performing the regulatory function. And there's a process for approval in statute.
Would that be when the legislature is in session or not in session?
It looks like statute allows for both situations. So if it's submitted to the Joint Fiscal Committee, it's considered approved unless it's within 30 days put on the agenda of the Joint Fiscal Committee, or when the General Assembly is in session, requests that it be submitted for legislative approval. So I think if the General Assembly is in session and the Joint Fiscal Committee gets such a request, they can request that the entire legislature approve it.
It's triggered by a request, or could the Joint Fiscal Committee do it on their own?
The way I read this is that the Joint Fiscal Committee would request that it be submitted for legislative approval.
But can the Joint Fiscal Committee do that of its own volition, or does anyone need to request it of the Joint Fiscal Committee?
So I think the agency would be going to the Joint Fiscal Committee to request this change, and then the Joint Fiscal Committee could choose to just do it, or if the legislature is in session, could themselves request that the full legislature look at it.
Thank you.
Because the language focuses on changes, it would already have to have been established by the General Assembly, that category. And then the way I'm thinking or reading of it, it at least takes the complicity or cooperation of the agency because somebody has to supply the cost justification. And that, I think, has to rest with the agency whose fee is at issue,
Yeah, that's what.
rather than the Joint Fiscal Committee making a cost determination. But I'm just reading it that way.
This would be a proposal from an agency. I don't think the Joint Fiscal Committee would be unilaterally taking it up.
I'm reading it.
Next slide, the executive branch annual fee report. So annually, the governor is required to submit a consolidated executive branch fee report and request to the General Assembly. There is a schedule and statute for how these requests, the reports are supposed to be provided in terms of on this 3-year cycle. And so beginning July 2011, there's certain areas of government starting that year, which would have their fees reported by the administration. And then they wouldn't have it again happen until 2014 and so on and on. And however, we just haven't been following this 3-year cycle. So I can just let you know what the cycle was. So it was the first area of government was general government, labor, general education, commerce and community development, and transportation. The second year of the cycle is human services and natural resources. And the third is protections to persons and property.
Are you on slide 6? Sorry, I was writing something down.
I unhappily don't have numbers on my slide,
Oh.
so. let me see.
Executive branch annual fee report and request. Annually, the governor's request.
Yeah, I'm on that and I'm moving to the next.
All right, slide. So I have a question.
Sure.
When the governor does not submit this branch fee report and request, who has recourse to that?
So the governor has been, there is a fee report that the governor has been submitting every year. There's just not sort of I can go over what the report should include in terms of a request for proposals, but there is a report of all the fees and it has all the information that is required in statute. There are just no requests to change those fees.
I see. So in you saying the governor has complied with this because he or he in this case didn't want to ask for a fee increase in anything.
There was no sort of request part of the report.
Oh, so you're required to submit, but not required to request. It says required to submit and request.
I don't want to put Becky in a position where she is ruling on whether the governor complied with statute or
But
not.
I just want to see how to read it.
I know that's where you're going. I just want to you're up for Becky that she doesn't have to answer that part of the question.
I just want to see how to read the sentence. Is required to submit a fee report and request.
So I will read, so statute says the governor shall, by the third Tuesday of every annual legislative session, submit a consolidated executive branch fee report and request to the General Assembly, and that's supposed to come with the annual budget report. And then statute goes on to say the fee report should include certain information, and then the fee request should include certain information. So on the next slide, I have what should be included in the fee report, which is for any fee that is in existence on the preceding July 1st the statutory authorization, the current rate or amount and when it was set or adjusted, the fund where the revenue is deposited, revenues derived from that fee over the last 2 fiscal years, and whether the governor recommends any fee to be altered, reauthorized, or terminated. So the report that is on the General Assembly website does list all of the fees and all of that information.
So does it list 1/3 of the fees? Or does it list all the fees?
I think this is listing all of them, but I actually,
Tell you by grouping them into the groups that you just read aloud to us a few minutes ago, the 1/3. Did you know Otto Troutz?
yeah, I did.
Okay, he was
Used to,
a
yeah.
genius.
He used to like sing the fee report to the committee.
Oh.
Like he had like a very special way of presenting it every year. Or poem, yeah.
Yes, or song or something. He was extremely creative, but he knew fees inside and out. And I think what's been happening is, since the fees are theoretically supposed to support the creation of and the work that it takes to pay for whatever it is the fee covers, like say milking machine grades, okay? It's supposed to pay for that, but it never did. The 12 years that I was involved with the fee bill, it never did, for not one fee. So the rest of that money came out of general government, the general fund. And I think what's happening is somehow, because they're not increasing fees to keep pace with inflation either, much less the actual cost of producing the good or service that is in the fee, that the fee is supposed to report, because that's not happening, they're taking it out of general fund or somewhere. It's got to be something that's not coming from the fee. The fee bill funds don't support the creation of the product. So I think they're taking it out of the general fund. But that can't go on forever because we can't afford it. We can't, I mean, these fees increase at the rate of inflation and paying the staff and all that. And so I mean, we should have someone in who knows about that finance. Otto used to know about it. Who took his place?
I actually don't know, but I think that Ted, yeah.
JFO right after.
Yeah, I think there was a report, which I'll note in my slide, that was touching on a lot of what you're asking about. And I think JFO can speak to sort of the fund deficits that have arisen as a result of the change in the fee.
It's kind of a tedious little thing. And folks roll their eyes when I start talking about fees, but you can't just let them go. They have to remain in control of them. And if we're not, then it's going to get out of hand. And I'm worried that it has gotten out of hand. Do you think it's gotten out of hand?
I don't know that I'm allowed to comment on that. I might ask Ted if my understanding was that the report does not follow the 3 years anymore, but do you have a different understanding of
The
that?
most recent fee report was kind of a more special fee report,
Okay.
so it includes the full set.
Yeah, that's what I understood it to be.
But let's finish yours.
Okay.
And this what you're sharing with us is important to me because a lot of us were not here the last time in the legislature, let alone the last time a fee bill moved. And so I think it's helpful for us to just even understand how it's supposed to work.
I really appreciate your patience.
Of course, yeah.
I'll stop.
I'm here to answer questions if I can. So the statute also includes that the fee request shall contain proposals for creating a new fee or change or reauthorize or terminating an existing fee, setting a new or adjusting an existing fee rate or amount, or designating or redesignating the fund into which revenue is deposited. And then on the next slide, There is also a process and statute for the judiciary branch to submit an annual fee report and request. And this comes every 3 years from either the justices of the Supreme Court or the court administrator. And they are also required to submit a consolidated fee report and request to the General Assembly. In general, the requirements of the fee report and request are the same as what needs to be included in the executive branch. There was language, I'm not sure if some of you were here for this, but there was language added within the last 2 years that says that sort of specifically for the judicial branch report, they have to include any fees associated with e-filings and any proposals to reauthorize, change, or terminate those fees in their report. On the next slide, so what is the legislature supposed to do when they get this fee report and request? The request and report is forwarded to the Ways and Means Committee, which is required to consult with other standing committees of jurisdiction on the fees in their subject areas. And then Ways and Means is directed to introduce a consolidated fee bill, which proposes the creation, change, reauthorization, or termination of any fee, the amount of a newly created fee or change in amount of an existing or reauthorized fee, the designation or redesignation of the fund into which the fee revenue goes to. And then sort of going to some of the questions that were raised on the last slide. In last year's big bill, there was a report that was required from the administration that asked for sort of an inventory of all existing fees within the state government to go to the Joint Fiscal Committee. And that included everything collected by the executive branch, the Attorney General, and the state treasurer. The Secretary of State was also directed to do the same. And the information that was supposed to be included in this inventory is similar to a lot of what is in statute. So the statutory authorization and termination date of those fees, the current rates or amounts, and the date it was last set or adjusted by the General Assembly or the Joint Fiscal Committee, where the fee revenues are being deposited, what the fee revenues are over the last 2 fiscal years, and for licensing and registration fees, whether the fee is collected annually, biennially, or some other set time frame. The Commissioner of Finance and Management was also supposed to submit a list of funds with a deficit at the end of the most recent fiscal year or an expected deficit, and when general funds are needed to address a fund deficit or operating costs supported by the fund. And then finally, a list of programs where the fees are not fully covering the cost of what is being provided by the service or regulatory function. And so I can, unless there are other questions, I can maybe turn to Ted to provide you with that information.
So this is all existing language.
Yes, this was in last year's, in the Act 185 from last year.
Which is the budget bill?
The budget bill, yeah. And
Back to the slide, authority to create, review, and adjust. It'd be adjusted by the Joint Fiscal Committee. Is that, it looks like it's a different font, so that's not new.
no, that's what's in statute. Yeah, it's not new.
Anyone else? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
When was the effective date of the fee inventory and fund deficit? It says 185 of 2022. Was it commencing now or next year?
The information was due November 15th of last year. And then the information on the list of programs by departments where the fees aren't fully covering the costs of the service or function was due a few days ago.
Okay, so, okay. Do we know if it,
We are about to hear about that from Jay.
Okay.
Thank you for teeing up our next speaker.
ever curious?
Yes.
Well, following in the tradition of auto trap, I'll be doing some of this in interpretive dance. Just kidding. For the record, I know, for the record, I'm Ted Barnett with the Joint Fiscal Office. I will be going a little bit more into the fiscal side of fees and some of the special fee reports and fund reports that have been provided by Finance and Management. So general outline, I'm on slide 2. Has everyone been able to open my presentation? Great. So I was planning to go through a little bit of, some of this will be overlapping with what Becky covered, but why do we have fees? Some kind of the historical process of fees and provide a little more context on that. Some statutory progress referring to some of the more special fee reports that were required both in the budget bill in 2021 and 2022 last session. And then finally, some basic preliminary findings of digging through a spreadsheet with over 1,500 rows in it. Yes, it's quite a big one. So to start, why do we have fees? As Becky mentioned, there should be, the idea is, right, there's some sort of connection between the cost of services that are provided by the government and the revenue that supports these services. So for example, DMV fund or fees go into the transportation fund, hunting permit fees go to a Fish and Wildlife Fund. So you have a clear connection between the service and the revenue that's created. And sometimes when these do not line up, you have appropriations from the general fund, which may be necessary, which diminishes that connection. So if you're pulling in money from the general fund, then you're asking all taxpayers to pay for this particular service in part. On slide 4, this is a review of the general outline of how fee or parts of government would report their fees and request any changes. The consolidated fee report would go to Ways and Means per 32 VSA 606. And every 3 years, a department would present revised fees as a part of the legislative fee bill. We have general government, labor, general education, commerce, community development and transportation starting in 2011, human services and natural resources starting in 2012, protection to persons and property starting in 2013. The last major fee bill occurred during the 2019 session, and that was Act 70. This updated some financial regulation charges, judiciary fees, Secretary of State, and other fees. On slide 5, I wanted to present a visual overview of how the intention and statute actually played out in fee bill reality. So your outlined boxes with the bold, that is to highlight when this particular area of government was supposed to report on fees. For example, commerce, right, is 2011, 2014, 2017, 2020 going through. And in 2011, they updated their fees. In 2014, they reported but did not update. 2017, similar story. So those darker blues are when fees were, or different areas were supposed to, where they reported on their fees, but they didn't change any. And the green are where some of, or all of the fees in that specific area did change. And as you can see, after, 2016 was our last really large fee bill. And then after that, there's been, there hasn't really been much action on fees.
Yeah.
I'm looking for where agriculture.
Agriculture would go under commerce would be my, no, I'm getting, sorry.
It has its own home.
It has its own home, okay.
It's agriculture and food. It has a new name.
Oh, ag, food and market.
Resiliency and forestry?
Something, yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Sure.
Yes.
If you netted out fees that are the responsibility of constitutional officers and offices like Secretary of State, Treasurer, how would that change your diagram?
It would change it. So a lot of Secretary of State fees are under the protection line. And so it would kind of reduce a lot of the protection ones. Outside of that, judiciary kind of has its own what I'm going to fall into. Yes. So outside of that, it's executive branch fees. Yeah.
OPR. Where's the O?
That would
Secretary of State.
Mhm.
That. Okay, we used to get those separately though, I think.
Yes, and that in their fee report is a separate part of the process. Just for this figure, they are included in the protection line. But yes, we have a Secretary of State is a separate fee report that they submitted. And I know they will be in, I think, tomorrow to talk about their fees. Mm-hmm. And then on slide 6, there is a little bit of just mentioning that fees have changed piecemeal with various pieces of legislation and the creation of new programs. For example, when recreational cannabis market was created, there was a whole new set of fees that had to be created to fund the actions of the control board. On slide 7, this is where I get into talking about their 2 major changes in fee reporting. So the FY22 budget required finance and management to report on what each fee would be if the fee were changed to reflect the level of inflation in that report. So this report focused on fees with over $1 million in revenue, and that report found that 22 million in new revenue could have been generated if fees had kept up with inflation. In 2023, the fee finance and management was to produce a special fee report that included information, as Becky mentioned, on which funds were in a deficit at the end of the most recent fiscal year, so at the end of fiscal year 22, or was expected to be in deficit in fiscal year 23, whether general funds were needed in any of the last 3 years to address a fund deficit or to support the related operating costs of programs, and then finally to prepare a report on or before January 15th. That includes a list of programs by department where the fees do not fully cover the cost of providing that service or regulatory function. From that report, the special fee report showed that 19 funds were in deficit at the end of 22. I did not list them all. And 6 of these funds are expected to have a deficit in fiscal year 23. That includes fire prevention in the building inspection special fund, the enhanced 911 special fund, emergency relief and assistance fund, the Act 250 permit fund, hydroelectric licensing, and then public safety VAST fund. And 2 of those funds do not receive any specific fee revenues. They're supported by charges or appropriations. On slide 9.
So do agencies normally backfill, or like what happens when you have a negative deficit or you have a deficit in your funds to provide the services that you are obligated to provide?
It depends. Some agencies do their appropriations are provided to some agencies if they need it, and then some do backfill to the extent they can. It's complicated because special funds are their revenue is allocated to a specific program or service.
Yeah.
So if I'm reading this short list, I don't see anything on here that's within the purview of the Agency of of Natural Resources or Environmental Conservation, and yet there are lots of fee programs for wastewater, for this, for that. So can I deduce that their costs haven't gone up in 6 years, or what do I determine from that?
This was really a point in time snapshot, and really understanding what's happening in specific funds requires drilling down into that.
Who drills?
It's a great question.
So my understanding is that the full fee report and all those spreadsheet lines that you've talked about, doing more analysis on.
Yes.
I think one of the things to answer your question, Representative Sims, that I think in some cases, general fund transfers, right? Like, as you said, Representative Brannigan, like general fund transfers are covering some of that. I think in other cases, government just
Fails.
isn't funded at the level that perhaps it should be in statute. And one of the things that I worry about in this context is the inequities of, I think some agencies or departments have agency or department leaders that are able to advocate for those general fund transfers or some of these ad hoc fee increases, and then other departments can't. And so we wind up with this very uneven landscape that creates even more inequities in an already sort of fragile ecosystem. And I think once we drill down into your data, is that something that we'll be able to see more clearly?
To the extent it lines up where you have that the fund is clearly listed on the line item and they all go into a separate thing, but then I, on the other hand, cannot see example expenses. I can only see the revenue side. And so you would have to connect with the specific department to understand what their expense side looks like.
Are you able to identify when other general fund transfers happen to sort of balance that deficit? So like, are we able to see where insolvency is addressed and the places where it isn't?
Yes, this report has information on that to some extent. And then also we have a budget team that's really fantastic and knows the budget inside out, backwards and forwards. So in terms of certain questions and where appropriations have happened, I would definitely ask them.
Back to you.
Great. So on slide 9, this is the report that came out most recently. It came out in January 17th. And so they noted Department of Finance and Management noticed challenges with the understanding which programs are not supported by current fees, but gave the following programs as ones that are not currently supported. One is the Cannabis Control Board. This is largely because they're still ramping up and getting to market maturity. There's the Center for Crime Victim Services. This has an asterisk because the way this is funded is changed starting in fiscal year 23. It's done through appropriation rather than relying on diminishing fees. The Fire Safety Division, which ties back to the Fire Prevention Building Inspection Fund that was noted to have a deficit in 23, fiscal year 23. The Stream Flow Protection section of the Department of Environmental Conservation, so that's the Environment one. Yeah. And then we have the Enhanced 911 Board, the Act 250 program, and the Office of Professional Regulation in the Secretary of State's office.
So question about, this is kind of like how the puzzle pieces fit together. So the Center for Crime Victim Services has been fee driven and now no longer will be. But we haven't addressed the fee that would be put into that fund. So we're just, as a state, still gonna put money in that fund until someone says, please stop, or arguably we say, please stop, right? And then what, does that money just revert back to the general fund? It's a lot of questions at once, so.
So to start, I had a conversation, so Dan in our office used to do fees for a long time. And this one's a special case because the actions of providing these services moved to the judiciary. And so I think this is like a slightly outside case.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
But, so what would happen if we decided that we just didn't want to do fees anymore and we wanted it all to come from the general fund? What would happen then? Because that's where we're headed. Because I think you just said that this gets picked up by general fund resources. Or maybe it was Becky who said that, I don't know, somebody, but it was mentioned this morning. So if we are headed down that path to just not do fees anymore at all, because there's obviously not being kept up, what would happen if it all just came out of the general fund? Do we know what increase that would be, or would we count it as an increase because we're paying for it now?
So we don't have, I mean, you could look and add up all of the fees. I think the question of what would happen is it's a much more complicated one. Yeah, so there is, you could calculate a number. I would say that what is being supported by the general fund is a relatively small percentage of the overall universe of fees. But I could do more digging into what that specific number is.
So what would happen if we got rid of all the fees and we didn't do fees anymore? No more revenue coming in to DMV like that. It just all came out of the general fund. What would that mean?
That would mean more taxes.
Just like, I think you're asking, what's the total of all fees collected right now?
Okay, I can provide you with that figure for sure.
Okay.
Yes, are you looking for a figure of like what the sum total of fees are?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, I could definitely provide you with that number. Yes.
And my point is that we're paying for it now. It's coming out of the general fund. And I don't know the thought process of not having fees. I think it's to relieve taxpayers of burden or fee payers of burden, but it's not really, because someone's paying for it. Someone's picking up that tab. Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, I think I'm hearing that in some cases, maybe in some agencies, there are requests that lead to a general fund transfer, but in many cases, we're not covering it. And then either the department is unable to provide the service that's expected, or people work more hours, not pay, there's no requirement that the general fund cover a deficit.
Yes.
These are all good questions for the administration. This is conjecture right now.
Yeah, so who would be the source person there? Adam?
I think we could have either Adam Gushinin or someone from the Agency of Administration. Someone else.
I think we should do that if we're concerned about the taxpayers and the fee payers.
That's good.
Great.
Yeah.
I don't mean to put you on the hot seat.
No problem.
Stay for it.
It's the hot seat. So on slide 10, some initial thoughts in looking through the fee report. One is that unsurprisingly, different data departments have different data systems, and so the reported data did vary by department. And we'll go into kind of two examples in subsequent slides. And then one is I just wanted to highlight, right, so the report from Finance and Management that gave a $22 million figure, really focused on fees that generated more than $1 million in fee revenue in that year. If you look at all of the smaller fees, people hauling less than 10,000 pounds of whatever product Y, if you look at all of those fees, there's quite a bit more in revenue, new revenue that could be generated if those fees kept up with inflation. And then finally, just highlighting again that this is a really high level picture. If you want to drill into a specific fund or fee, it really is ones that are, the ones that are in deficit, it's kind of a case by case basis to understand both the revenue and the expense side. So the first example is from the Department of Agriculture. They have the complete information required by statute. Their fees, with the exception of most of them were updated in the 2015 fee bill. And if you had fees keep pace with inflation, that would net about $1 million more in additional fees above the projected $6.4 million in revenue. So it's a pretty sizable figure. Natural resources as an area, broadly speaking, it contains 419 fees. It includes everything from hunting licenses to ski area leases. It's a wide world of fees. Many of these fees were last changed in 2016, but at a preliminary look, if you had the fees in this area updated for inflation, it would net $4 million more on a projected $40 million base.
Only 10%?
Only 10%. So it depends.
Over that period of time?
Yes. So some of them were changed a little bit later. So if fees changed in 2019, you're rated a little bit smaller. We only have inflation through 2022, and the inflation measure, to be conservative, because the JFO, we like being conservative, is a measure PCE that is a slightly lower inflation metric than CPI. There are conversations at JFO to really talk about which metric is the best to look at inflation. But if you were to look at CPI, it might be higher.
And for my education, could you tell me what PCI is?
Sure. So PCE is personal consumption expenditure. It's the inflation metric used by the Federal Reserve.
Okay.
It looks at a wider, the basket of what it measures for inflation of goods changes. CPI is more of a fixed measure. So I used it because it is used by the Federal Reserve.
Saoirse, at some point it might be helpful to have just a primer on all the different inflation metrics, because we use different ones when we're talking about the ed fund than we tend to when we're talking about general fund and things, and that might be, given how much talk there is of inflation in the broader public lately, it might be interesting to talk about how to measure it for various, because we're often throwing in an inflator into something, and it would be nice for us all to sort of have that same basis for that conversation.
Sure.
Representative Taylor.
That 4 million in the last bullet, is that per year?
That is per year, yes.
Okay.
And one final point about the $4 million figure, when there wasn't data, I wasn't able to inflate that particular fee, so it's really a lower bound. So some of the fees that don't have full information, unable to go and do the calculation of what it would cost if it were inflated. So that's part of the reason it may be a little lower. And then on slide 13, I really just wanted to bring the conversation around fees back to some of the earlier presentations around anatomy of a tax and the 6 considerations of a high quality tax system, because fees in many ways behave like a tax as a way to raise revenue. So first of all, to catch up with inflation, most fees would have to increase by at least 15% given the length of time since the last fee bill. The difference between 2016 dollars and current dollars, or at least that amount. Also wanted to note, thinking about who pays a specific fee, and thinking about the capacity of the user who is subject to that fee. An example is there's a 10-cent fee on every prescription that is written. The licenses is a different area than maybe a bank that's paying a fee. So thinking about who's doing the paying of the fee is important when reviewing fees. Wanted to put a note on looking at the rate versus the base. A small increase on a fee that has a wider base, like many DMV fees, will raise more revenue than a large increase on a fee that doesn't have as wide of a base. And then finally, if the legislature decides to act, does it want to target the fees that are in need, those fees that are in deficit, the fees that have been mentioned where the revenue raised doesn't pay for the service, or does it want to look at a broader set of fees and take a wider look? So that is all I have for y'all today.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Saoirse is posting the fee reports that we talked about. If folks want to dive in later. And I think with that, I'm going to give people back the 10 minutes that they didn't get at our previous break and see everyone at 1:15.
Yes.
Yep.